Sometimes love finds us when we're broken, and sometimes it breaks us when we think we're whole. In the frontier town of Dustvale, Rosanna Finch had given up on being wanted by any man after the stagecoach accident left her barely able to walk. Then one Sunday morning, Josiah "Bull" Cartwright shocked everyone by lifting her from the church steps. This giant of a rancher, who owned half the county, declared loud enough for all to hear, "This woman will give me the sons I need." The whole town fell silent. Nobody understood why the most powerful man in Dustvale would choose a crippled bride. When he could have anyone, what makes a broken woman worth fighting for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The music box had been silent for 3 years now, its delicate silver surface tarnished by neglect and tears. Rosanna Finch kept it on the small wooden table beside her bed, a reminder of the woman she used to be, the one who danced at church, socials and hummed melodies while helping her father prepare his Sunday sermons. Now, as she traced her finger along its intricate engravings, she could barely remember the sound of her own laughter. The morning sun streamed through the thin curtains of the parsonage, casting long shadows across the modest room she'd called home since returning from the territorial hospital. Her father, Reverend Thomas Finch, had aged 10 years in the months following her accident, his once proud shoulders now bent with worry and his silver hair grown thin from sleepless nights spent praying for his daughter's healing, both physical and spiritual. "Rosanna, child, your breakfast is ready," his gentle voice called from the kitchen. She could hear the carefully measured tone he used now, the way he spoke to her as if she were made of spun glass that might shatter at any harsh word. She pushed herself upright in the narrow bed, her left leg protesting with its familiar sharp pain. The doctors in territorial capital had done what they could, setting the bones that had been crushed when the stagecoach rolled down the rocky embankment. But some things, they explained with clinical detachment, simply couldn't be made whole again. The leg would always be shorter now, twisted at an angle that made each step a deliberate act of will, rather than the natural grace she'd once possessed. 3 years ago, Rosanna had been the belle of Dustvale. At 22, she'd had her pick of suitors, young men who competed for the honor of escorting the preacher's beautiful daughter to town celebrations. She remembered how her blue cotton dress would swirl around her ankles as she spun on the dance floor, how her dark hair would catch the lamplight, and how the young men would line up just to hear her musical laugh. The accident had changed everything. In the span of a heartbeat, she'd been traveling to the territorial capital to visit her ailing aunt when the stagecoach driver, rushing to make up time, took a mountain curve too fast. The coach had rolled 3 times down a steep ravine, killing 2 passengers instantly and leaving Rosanna trapped beneath the wreckage for nearly 6 hours before rescue came. Her screams had echoed off the canyon walls until her voice gave out entirely. Now, at 25, she moved through her days like a ghost of her former self. The townspeople of Dustvale treated her with the kind of pitying kindness reserved for broken things, gentle smiles, careful words, and eyes that looked everywhere but directly at her twisted leg. The young men who had once competed for her attention now tipped their hats politely and hurried past, their gazes fixed firmly on the dusty street. "I'm coming, Papa," she called back, reaching for the carved wooden walking stick that had become as much a part of her as her own shadow. Each morning began the same way. The struggle to rise, the careful navigation of familiar rooms, the pretense that she was managing just fine when everything inside her screamed that she was slowly disappearing. The kitchen smelled of coffee and bacon, simple comforts that her father prepared with the same methodical care he brought to his sermons. Reverend Finch looked up from his place at the small table, his weathered face brightening with the forced cheer he'd perfected over. "The past 3 years. Mrs. Patterson stopped by yesterday evening after you'd retired," he said, spooning scrambled eggs onto her plate. She mentioned that the church ladies are organizing another social for next month. Perhaps you might consider... Papa. Rosanna's voice was quiet, but firm. We both know I won't be attending any socials. The Reverend's hand stilled over his coffee cup. These conversations had become routine, his gentle attempts to coax her back into the world, and her equally gentle but absolute refusals. She understood his motivation. He wanted his daughter to live again, to find some measure of the joy she'd lost. But he couldn't understand that the woman who had danced and laughed and captured men's hearts was as dead as if she'd died in that stagecoach wreck. Outside the kitchen window, Dustvale was coming to life. The town sat in a valley between rolling hills, its main street a dusty ribbon connecting the general store, the saloon, the blacksmith shop, and the modest church where her father preached every Sunday. It was cattle country, where men were judged by the strength of their backs and the size of their herds, and women by their ability to bear children and manage households. In this harsh landscape, there was no place for a crippled woman who would never dance again, never run to greet her husband at the end of a long day, never chase children through the yard. Rosanna had accepted this truth with the same resigned grace with which she'd learned to walk with a stick. But if the people of Dustvale thought they understood their world completely, they were about to be proven wrong. Because at that very moment on the largest ranch in the territory, a man was making a decision that would shake the foundations of everything they believed about strength, about worth, and about love itself. Josiah Cartwright, known to everyone simply as Bull, stood 6 feet and 4 inches in his stockinged feet and carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who'd never had to raise his voice to be heard. At 35, he owned the most successful cattle operation in 3 counties, commanded the respect of every rancher from here to the territorial capital, and could have married any woman he chose. He was also the loneliest man in Dustvale. Bull's father had built the Cartwright ranch from nothing, claiming the land when it was still contested territory, and fighting off claim jumpers, drought, and disease to establish what would become a cattle empire. Before his death 5 years prior, old Magnus Cartwright had extracted a promise from his son. The Cartwright name would continue, the ranch would pass to strong sons, and the legacy would endure. It was a promise that haunted Bull's every waking moment. He'd tried courting the eligible women in town, but they all seemed like silly girls to him, interested only in his money and status. He'd even traveled to the territorial capital seeking a wife among the more sophisticated women there, but found them equally shallow, more concerned with their appearance than with the hard realities of ranch life. Meanwhile, time was passing. At 35, he was already older than his father had been when Bull was born. The pressure of his promise weighed on him like a stone in his chest, growing heavier with each passing season. Then, 3 months ago, he'd seen her, Rosanna Finch, sitting alone in the back pew of the church during her father's Sunday service, her dark head bowed in prayer. She'd been beautiful before the accident, certainly, but Bull had never paid her much attention then. She'd seemed too delicate, too much like a hothouse flower that would wilt under the harsh demands of ranch life. But watching her now, seeing the quiet dignity with which she bore her suffering, the way she listened to every word of her father's sermon with complete attention, the grace with which she accepted the pitying glances of the other congregants, Bull saw something that no one else seemed to notice. He saw strength, not the obvious, physical strength that men valued in horses and cattle, but something deeper and more enduring. Here was a woman who had faced the worst life could offer and emerged unbroken in spirit. Here was someone who understood pain and had chosen to endure rather than surrender. Over the following weeks, Bull found excuses to visit town more frequently. He'd nod respectfully to Rosanna when their paths crossed, noting how she always met his eyes directly, without the simpering or fluttering that characterized most women's interactions with him. She treated him like any other person, neither intimidated by his reputation, nor attempting to charm him. The idea had been growing in his mind for weeks now, taking shape like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It was audacious, perhaps even foolish, but Bull Cartwright hadn't built the largest ranch in the territory by playing it safe. This morning, as he stood in his bedroom looking at the simple gold ring that had belonged to his mother, he made his decision. The ring had been waiting in his dresser drawer for 15 years, saved for the woman who would become the mother of his children and the keeper of his legacy. Today, he would ask Rosanna Finch to marry him. The decision felt right in a way that surprised him. Not because he was in love, he was practical enough to know the difference between love and need, but because he recognized in her something that all his wealth and power couldn't buy. An unbreakable spirit wrapped in a form that others saw as broken. Bull understood better than most that true strength often came disguised as weakness, and that the most valuable things were often found in the most unlikely places. In Rosanna Finch, he saw the mother his children would need, not a delicate beauty who would crumble at the first hardship, but a woman who had already proven she could survive anything. As he pocketed the ring and prepared to ride into town, Bull felt a certainty he hadn't experienced in years. Let the town gossip and whisper, let them question his judgment. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was claiming the strongest woman in Dustvale. The wedding ring felt heavier than it should have as Bull turned it over in his palm, the simple gold band catching the morning light streaming through the church windows. It had been his mother's ring, worn smooth by years of hard work and gentle love. And now it would belong to Rosanna Finch, a woman he barely knew, but somehow understood better than any of the eligible ladies who had thrown themselves at his feet. Reverend Finch stood at the altar with the uncertain expression of a man who'd been asked to perform a ceremony he didn't fully comprehend. When Bull had arrived at the parsonage 3 days earlier with his proposal, the Reverend's initial shock had given way to careful consideration. His daughter needed security, and Bull Cartwright could certainly provide that. But the speed of it all, the practical nature of the arrangement, left the old preacher with a heavy heart. "I suppose we should begin," Reverend Finch said, his voice carrying across the half-empty church. The pews held perhaps 20 people, a modest gathering for what was being called the wedding of the year in Dustvale. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row, her lips pursed in disapproval she was too polite to voice openly. Behind her, a handful of ranch hands shifted uncomfortably in their Sunday clothes, while the few townspeople who had come whispered behind their hands. Bull stood tall beside the altar, his massive frame somehow making the small church seem even smaller. He wore his best black suit, the one reserved for funerals, and the rare occasions when business took him to the territorial capital. His dark hair was slicked back with pomade, and his usually stubbled jaw was clean-shaven for the occasion. To anyone watching, he looked like a man preparing for a business transaction rather than a wedding. The church door opened with a soft creak, and Rosanna appeared in the doorway. A collective intake of breath swept through the gathered witnesses. She wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her slighter frame, the ivory silk somehow making her dark hair appear even richer. But it wasn't her beauty that captured everyone's attention. It was the way she moved. Each step was deliberate, measured, her walking stick tapping softly against the wooden floor. Her father had offered to escort her down the aisle, but she had quietly insisted on making the journey alone. This was her choice, her decision, and she would enter into it with whatever dignity she could muster. Bull watched her approach with an expression that gave nothing away, but those who knew him well might have noticed the slight softening around his eyes. She was lovely, certainly, but more than that. She carried herself with a quiet courage that commanded respect. When she reached the altar, he offered his arm, not to support her weight, but simply as a gesture of partnership. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Finch began, his voice stronger now that the moment had arrived, "we are gathered here today to witness the union of Josiah Cartwright and Rosanna Finch in holy matrimony. The ceremony proceeded with the traditional words, but there was nothing traditional about the undercurrents flowing between the bride and groom. When Bull slipped the ring onto Rosanna's finger, their eyes met for the first time that day. In that moment, something passed between them. Not love, perhaps, but a recognition of mutual need and respect. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Finch announced, though his voice carried a note of uncertainty. Bull leaned down, his hands gentle as they framed Rosanna's face, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was both chaste and surprisingly tender. When they parted, he whispered something that only she could hear. "I'll be patient with you." The words sent an unexpected warmth through her chest, though she kept her expression composed. This man had just promised her security and consideration, more than she had dared hope for when she'd agreed to his proposal. As they turned to face their small congregation as husband and wife, the whispers began in earnest. Mrs. Patterson dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, though whether from joy or sorrow was unclear. The ranch hands shuffled their feet and avoided direct eye contact, uncertain how to process their boss's surprising choice. The reception was held in the church social hall, a modest affair with cake provided by the church ladies and coffee strong. Enough to wake the dead. Bull remained close to Rosanna's side throughout the brief celebration, not because he was particularly affectionate, but because he seemed to understand that she needed the support of his presence to face the curious stares and barely concealed gossip. "Mrs. Cartwright," said Doc Henley, approaching them with his characteristic directness, "I hope you'll allow me to continue monitoring your health. The changes in your daily routine will be handled carefully." Bull interrupted, his tone making it clear that Rosanna's welfare was now his responsibility. Rosanna looked up at her new husband with surprise. She had expected to be treated as an obligation, a necessary burden in his quest for heirs. She hadn't expected protection. As the afternoon wore on and the guests began to disperse, Bull helped Rosanna into his wagon for the journey to the ranch. The Cartwright spread lay 5 miles outside of town, a vast expanse of rolling grassland dotted with cattle and bounded by the distant mountains. Rosanna had never seen it up close, though its reputation was known throughout the territory. "Are you frightened?" Bull asked as they rode through the gathering dusk, his deep voice cutting through the silence. Rosanna considered the question carefully. "Yes," she answered honestly, "but not of you." He glanced at her, his dark eyes reflecting something that might have been approval. "What then?" "Of disappointing you," she said quietly. "Of being less than what you need." Bull was silent. For a long moment, the only sounds the creaking of the wagon and the soft rhythm of the horse's hooves. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "I've spent 5 years looking for a woman strong enough to be a Cartwright. Every eligible lady in 3 counties has set her cap for me, and not one of them understood what that would mean. They saw the money and the land and thought it would be easy." He guided the horses around a bend in the road, and suddenly the ranch house came into view. A large, sturdy structure of logs and stone that spoke of permanence and prosperity. "But you," he continued, "you've already proven you can survive the worst life can throw at you. You've shown more strength in the last 3 years than most people show in a lifetime." Rosanna felt tears prick at her eyes, though she wasn't sure if they were from gratitude or sorrow. "And if I can't give you children?" Bull's hands stilled on the reins for just a moment before he resumed driving. "Then we'll face that together. But I have a feeling you're stronger than you know, Rosanna Cartwright." The sound of her new name on his lips sent another unexpected wave of warmth through her. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. As they pulled up to the ranch house, several hands emerged from the bunkhouse to help with her belongings. Bull climbed down from the wagon and came around to her side, not waiting for her to struggle down on her own, but lifting her easily in his arms and carrying her across the threshold. The gesture was traditional, but there was nothing theatrical about it. He carried her as if she weighed nothing, as if her twisted leg and walking stick were merely accessories rather than the disabilities that defined her in everyone else's eyes. Inside, the house was larger and more comfortable than she had expected, with well-made furniture and windows that looked out over the rolling ranch lands. It felt solid, permanent, like a place where a person could build a life. "Your room is upstairs," Bull said, setting her down gently in the front hallway. "Take all the time you need to settle in. We'll talk more tomorrow." As he turned to leave her alone, Rosanna found her voice. "Bull," he paused, looking back at her. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and promise, then disappeared into the depths of the house, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the growing realization that her life had just taken a turn she never could have imagined. The wedding ring felt strange on her finger, but not unpleasant. For the first time in 3 years, Rosanna Finch, now Rosanna Cartwright, allowed herself to wonder what tomorrow might bring. The branding iron hung on the wall of Bull's study like a piece of family scripture, its metal surface worn smooth by 3 generations of Cartwright hands. The distinctive C, surrounded by a circle, had marked thousands of cattle over the decades, each brand a declaration of ownership and legacy that stretched back to Bull's grandfather's first claim on this land. Rosanna discovered it on her 3rd morning at the ranch, when she'd finally gathered the courage to explore beyond her bedroom and the kitchen. The study was clearly Bull's private domain. Leather-bound ledgers lined the shelves, maps of the territory covered one wall, and the massive oak desk bore the scars of years of hard use. But it was the branding iron that drew her attention, its significance unmistakable. "That belonged to my father and his father before him." Bull's voice came from the doorway, causing her to turn carefully on her walking stick. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to intrude." You're not intruding. This is your home now." He stepped into the room, his presence somehow making the large space feel smaller. "That iron has branded every head of cattle on this ranch for 40 years. My grandfather designed it when he first claimed this land." Rosanna studied the simple but elegant design. "It's beautiful in its way. Strong. Strength is what built this place," Bull said, moving to stand beside her. "My grandfather fought claim jumpers and drought and disease to establish what we have here. My father expanded it, made it profitable, and now it's my responsibility to make sure it continues." There was something in his tone that made her look at him more closely. "That's a heavy burden." "It is." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "My father made me promise on his deathbed that the Cartwright name would continue, that strong sons would inherit this land." The words hung in the air between them, and Rosanna felt the familiar weight of expectation settling on her shoulders. She was here for a purpose, and that purpose was becoming clearer every day. "I understand," she said softly. Over the following weeks, Rosanna began to find her rhythm in the routines of ranch life. The house was larger than the parsonage, but felt more comfortable, with wide windows that looked out over endless grassland and furniture, built to last rather than merely to impress. Bull had assigned her a bedroom on the main floor, a thoughtful consideration of her mobility, though she suspected he'd told the ranch hands it was simply more convenient. The hands themselves had been a source of worry for her initially. These were hard men who worked in a harsh environment, and she'd expected them to view her as an unwelcome complication in their orderly world. Instead, she found them respectful if reserved, tipping their hats when they encountered her and going out of their way to assist her when needed without making it obvious. Tommy Brennan, the foreman, was a weathered man of 50 who'd worked for Bull's father before him. He treated Rosanna with the careful courtesy of someone who understood that the boss's wife, whatever her limitations, deserved respect. "Morning, Mrs. Cartwright," he said one day, as she sat on the front porch watching the men work with the horses in the nearby corral. "Beautiful day for it." "It is indeed," she replied, grateful for the simple normalcy of the exchange. "The horses are magnificent." Tommy's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a man discussing his passion. "That bay there, she's got bloodlines. Going back to some of the finest stock in Texas. Bull's got an eye for quality." As if summoned by his name, Bull emerged from the barn, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hat pushed back on his head. Even from a distance, Rosanna could see the easy confidence with which he moved among the animals, the way they responded to his presence with trust rather than fear. "He's good with them," she observed. "Best I've ever seen," Tommy agreed. "Animals know when a man's genuine. They can sense strength and honesty, don't much care for pretense or weakness." The comment wasn't meant as a slight, but it reminded Rosanna of her precarious position in this world. She was here on sufferance, accepted because Bull had chosen her, but she hadn't yet proven her worth. That evening, as had become their custom, she and Bull shared dinner in the large kitchen. These meals had evolved from stilted formal affairs to something approaching comfortable companionship. Bull wasn't much for small talk, but he answered her questions about the ranch operations and seemed genuinely interested in her observations about managing the household. "The ledgers in your study," she said carefully. "I noticed some of the entries seem to be in different handwriting." Bull looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "My father kept those books until he died. Before that, my grandfather. 3 generations of Cartwright business. It must be comforting having that continuity. Comforting and terrifying," he admitted. "Every decision I make affects not just the present, but the future. Every mistake could cost my children their inheritance." There it was again, the pressure of legacy, the weight of expectation that seemed to follow him everywhere. Rosanna set down her fork and studied his face in the lamplight. "What if you didn't have children?" she asked quietly. "What would happen to all of this?" Bull was silent for a long moment, his strong hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "I gave my father my word," he finally said. "The Cartwright name will continue." The certainty in his voice should have been reassuring, but Rosanna heard something else beneath it, a man trying to convince himself as much as her. She began to understand that Bull's need for an heir wasn't just about dynasty or pride. It was about keeping a promise to a dying man, honoring the sacrifice of generations who had built something lasting in an unforgiving land. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I understand what's expected of me, and I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to fulfill those expectations." Bull's dark eyes met hers across the table. "And I want you to know that I don't expect miracles overnight. We have time, Rosanna, and I have patience." The conversation marked a turning point in their relationship. Over the following days, Rosanna found herself more comfortable in Bull's presence, and he seemed more relaxed around her. They began to talk more freely about the ranch operations, and she discovered that he valued her opinions more than she'd expected. When she suggested reorganizing the kitchen storage to make meal preparation more efficient, he listened thoughtfully and approved the changes. When she noticed that some of the ledger entries were difficult to read and offered to help copy them into a new book, he accepted gratefully. "You have a fine hand," he said one evening, reviewing her work on the accounts. "Clear and neat, better than mine." "My father insisted on proper penmanship," she replied, pleased by the praise. "He said a person's handwriting reflected their character. Then yours reflects very well on you." It was a small compliment, but it warmed her more than it probably should have. She was beginning to realize that Bull's approval meant something to her, not just as her husband, but as a man whose opinion she was coming to respect. As the days passed, Rosanna found herself thinking less about the life she'd lost, and more about the one she was building. The ranch was beginning to feel like home, and Bull was beginning to feel like more than just the man who'd married her out of necessity. Perhaps, she thought, as she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the night, this unexpected marriage might become something more than either of them had bargained for. Rosanna's father's Bible lay open on her nightstand, its worn leather cover bearing the scars of decades of faithful use. Between the pages of Psalms, she'd pressed wildflowers from their old garden, dried forget-me-nots and baby's breath that had once filled their modest parsonage with fragrance. Now they served as bookmarks for the passages her father had underlined in his careful script, verses about strength and endurance that had sustained him through his wife's death and his daughter's long recovery. The book had been her wedding gift to herself, smuggled from the parsonage in her small collection of personal belongings. Some nights, when sleep eluded her and the weight of her new circumstances pressed heavy on her chest, she would read the familiar words and hear her father's voice in the cadence of Scripture. Tonight was one of those nights. 2 months had passed since her marriage to Bull, and while their relationship had settled into something approaching companionship, she remained painfully aware of the expectations that hung unspoken between them. He'd been patient, as promised, but she could see the questions in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. A soft knock at her bedroom door interrupted her reading. "Rosanna, are you awake?" Bull's voice was carefully neutral, but she detected something different in it tonight, a tension that hadn't been there at dinner. "Come in," she called, closing the Bible and smoothing her nightgown. He entered carrying a lamp, its golden light casting dancing shadows on the walls. Still fully dressed despite the late hour, his dark hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. "I couldn't sleep," he said, setting the lamp on her dresser. "I've been thinking about our situation." The words sent a chill through her, though she kept her expression composed. "What aspect of it?" "We've been married 2 months, Rosanna. By now most wives would either be expecting or would have—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with how to phrase his concern delicately. "Would have failed," she finished for him, her voice steady despite the pain in her chest. "That's not what I meant, isn't it?" She met his gaze directly. "You married me for a specific purpose, Bull. We both know that, and so far, I've given you no indication that I can fulfill that purpose." Bull moved to the window, his broad shoulders tense beneath his shirt. "The doctor in town, Dr. Henley, he says that sometimes injuries like yours can affect my ability to bear children." The words came out harder than she'd intended. "Yes, I'm aware of that possibility, but he also said it might just take time, that your body needs to heal completely before I can be a proper wife to you." Bull turned from the window, his dark eyes intense in the lamplight. "You are a proper wife to me. You manage my household better than it's ever been. Managed. You keep my books with a precision that amazes me. You've earned the respect of every man on this ranch, but I haven't given you children." The simple statement hung between them like an accusation. Bull crossed the room and sat heavily in the chair beside her bed, his hands clasped between his knees. "My father," he said quietly, "was 43 when I was born. He'd been married to my mother for 12 years before she conceived. 12 years, Rosanna. The whole town thought they were barren. She hadn't known this. What changed? Time, patience, and my mother finally believing that she deserved happiness." He looked at her directly. "She told me once that she'd spent so many years thinking of herself as broken that her body believed it too. The parallel wasn't lost on her." "Are you saying this is my fault, that I'm preventing—" "I'm saying that maybe healing takes longer than either of us expected." His voice was gentle but firm. "I'm saying that maybe we need to start thinking of ourselves as husband and wife, not as business partners in a breeding arrangement." The words hit her like a physical blow, both for their bluntness and their truth. That was exactly what she'd been thinking of their marriage, as a transaction where she owed him something she might not be able to provide. "I don't know how to be anything else," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "For 3 years, I've defined myself by what I couldn't do. I can't dance, can't run, can't be the wife that most men would want. And now you're telling me that might be the very thing preventing me from giving you what you need most." Bull leaned forward in his chair. "What if what I need most isn't what I thought I needed when I married you?" The question caught her off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I married you because I thought you were strong enough to bear Cartwright children. But living with you these past 2 months, I've realized that you're strong enough for something much more important, which is to be my partner, my equal, not just the mother of my children, but the woman who stands beside me as we build something together. Rosanna felt tears threatening, though she wasn't sure if they were from hope or fear. And if I can't give you children? If your father's promise goes unfulfilled? Bull was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with thoughts. He'd never allowed himself to consider, then maybe my father's promise was about more than just blood, he finally said. Maybe it was about building something lasting, something that would honor the Cartwright name, whether or not it was carried by sons. The ranch hands respect you already, he continued. Tommy told me yesterday that you have better ideas about managing the books than he's heard in 20 years. Mrs. Patterson mentioned at church that you've been helping her organize supplies for the school. You're becoming part of this community, Rosanna. You're building a legacy of your own. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. You're being very kind. I'm being honest. He stood and moved toward the door, then paused. There's something else I want you to consider. What's that? Your father is planning to visit next week. He sent word today. I thought perhaps it was time he saw how well you've settled in here. Time he saw that his daughter is thriving, not just surviving. The news filled her with both joy and anxiety. She hadn't seen her father since the wedding, though they'd exchanged letters regularly. The thought of him seeing her in her new life, of showing him that she truly was managing well, appealed to her deeply. I'd like that very much, she said. Bull nodded, his hand on the door handle. Good. And Rosanna, when he comes, I want him to see you as I see you. Not as a broken woman who happened to find shelter, but as Mrs. Josiah Cartwright, my wife, my partner. After he left, Rosanna sat in the lamplight for a long time, her father's Bible open in her lap. She found herself thinking not about the verses that spoke of endurance and suffering, but about the ones that promised renewal and hope. Perhaps Bull was right. Perhaps healing, all kinds of healing, took longer than anyone expected. And perhaps it began not with accepting what you couldn't do, but with believing in what you could. The Mustang's halter hung from a nail in the barn wall, its leather braided with the kind of patient precision that spoke of long winter evenings and careful hands. Bull had crafted it himself during the previous year's harsh season, working the supple cowhide into intricate patterns while he waited for spring and the chance to capture the wild stallion that had been haunting his dreams. The horse was a legend in the territory. A magnificent bay with a white blaze that ran like lightning, down his face and spirit that no man had ever broken. For 3 years, Bull had been trying to bring the stallion to his ranch, not to break him, but to convince him that domestication didn't have to mean defeat. Rosanna discovered the halter on a warm morning in late summer, 4 months after their wedding, when she'd ventured into the barn to watch the ranch hands work with the newer horses. Her mobility had improved considerably since arriving at the ranch. The daily activity and better nutrition had strengthened her, though she still relied on her walking stick for longer distances. That's for Thunder, Tommy Brennan explained, when he noticed her examining the intricate braiding, the wild stallion that runs with the herd up in the north pasture. Bull's been trying to gentle him for years. Gentle him? She asked, intrigued by the terminology. Not break him, Tommy clarified, recognizing her confusion. Bull doesn't believe in breaking spirits. He says the best horses are partners, not slaves. That halter there represents about 40 hours of work, all for a horse that might never let him close enough to use it. The concept fascinated Rosanna. In her limited experience with men, she'd known only 2 approaches to power: domination or submission. The idea that strength could be negotiated rather than imposed was foreign to her understanding. That afternoon, when Bull returned from checking the herd boundaries, she asked him about the stallion. Thunder's been running free for 8 years, Bull explained as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "He's the smartest, strongest horse I've ever encountered. Every rancher in 3 counties has tried to capture him, and he's outwitted them all. But you think you can succeed where they failed?" Bull was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the wild herds sometimes appeared at twilight. "I don't want to capture him the way they do. I want him to choose me." The words resonated with something deep in Rosanna's chest. "That seems like it would take enormous patience." "The best things do." He glanced at her, and she caught something in his expression that made her wonder if they were still talking about horses. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Bull stood quickly, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip, a reaction that spoke of years living in territory where unexpected visitors could mean trouble. But these riders carried no threat. Tommy Brennan led them into the yard, and behind him rode Rosanna's father, looking older and more frail than she remembered, but with his eyes bright with anticipation. "Papa!" Rosanna rose as quickly as her leg would allow, her heart swelling with joy at the sight of him. Reverend Finch dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose bones protested every activity, but his smile was radiant as he embraced his daughter. "My dear child," he murmured against her hair, "you look wonderful, stronger than I've seen you in years." It was true, she realized. The constant activity of ranch life, the better nutrition, and perhaps most importantly, the sense of purpose had all contributed to her improved health. She stood straighter now, relied on her walking stick less frequently, and had gained weight that had filled out her hollow cheeks. "Come inside, Papa. I'll make coffee, and you can tell me all the news from town." As they settled in the kitchen, Reverend Finch looked around with obvious approval. The room was warm and welcoming, with fresh bread cooling on the counter and wildflowers from the meadow arranged in a simple vase. "You've made a real home here," he observed. "I can see happiness in your face, daughter." "I'm content, Papa," she said carefully. "Bull is a good man. He treats me with respect and kindness." "But do you love him?" The direct question caught her off guard. Her father had never been one to avoid difficult topics, but somehow she hadn't expected this one. She began, then stopped, realizing she didn't have a simple answer. "I care for him deeply. I admire his strength and his fairness. I feel safe with him." "That's not the same thing as love." "No," she agreed quietly, "but perhaps it's something more practical, more lasting." Her father studied her face in the afternoon light, streaming through the windows. "Your mother and I were blessed with the kind of love that poets write about, but I've seen many good marriages built on mutual respect and genuine affection. The key is knowing the difference between settling for less than you deserve and choosing something different than what you expected." Before Rosanna could respond, Bull appeared in the doorway. "Reverend Finch, welcome. I hope you'll stay with us for several days." "Thank you, son. I'd like that very much." The older man stood and shook Bull's hand. "I wanted to see how my daughter was faring in her new life." "She's thriving," Bull said simply. "She's become indispensable to the operation of this ranch." "Is that so?" "She's reorganized our entire bookkeeping system, improved our household efficiency by 30%, and yesterday she caught an error in our feed supplier's billing that saved us $50. Rosanna felt a flush of pride at his praise, but also noticed something in his tone, genuine appreciation rather than mere politeness. "And personally?" her father asked with the bluntness of a man who'd spent decades counseling troubled souls. "How is she as a wife?" Bull's eyes met Rosanna's across the kitchen. "She's the best partner I could have asked for." The word partner hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that went far beyond their practical arrangement. Rosanna felt something shift in her chest, a recognition that their relationship had evolved beyond what either of them had originally intended. That evening, as her father retired early from the journey, Bull and Rosanna found themselves alone on the front porch again. The night was warm and filled with the sounds of cattle settling and night birds calling. "Your father seems pleased with how you've settled in here," Bull observed. He is, and he likes you. That's important to me, Bull admitted. I want his blessing on our marriage. Don't you think it's a little late for that? We're already married. Bull turned to look at her, his expression serious. I want his blessing on what our marriage is becoming, not what it started as. The distinction was important, she realized. They'd begun as strangers bound by mutual need. But somewhere along the way, they'd become something else, something that felt more real and more valuable than either had expected. Bull, she said quietly. Yes, thank you. For bringing me here, for giving me a chance to be more than I thought I could be. Thank you, he replied, for proving that I was right about your strength. As they sat in comfortable silence, Rosanna found herself thinking about the Mustang's halter and Bull's patient approach to earning rather than demanding trust. Perhaps the best relationships, like the best horses, couldn't be broken to submission. Perhaps they had to be carefully, patiently gentled into partnership. The charred fence post stood like a blackened finger pointing toward the sky, its burned wood releasing the acrid smell of destruction into the morning air. Bull crouched beside it, running his fingers over the deliberately cut wire and the scorch marks that told a story of calculated intimidation. This wasn't lightning, Tommy Brennan said grimly, studying the neighboring posts that remained untouched. Someone set this fire on purpose. Bull's jaw tightened as he examined the damage. 3 sections of his northern boundary fence had been destroyed during the night, and 20 head of prime cattle had wandered onto the disputed land that bordered his property. It was the 3rd such incident in as many weeks, each one more brazen than the last. Morrison, he said quietly, the name carrying the weight of years of accumulated tension. Lucas Morrison owned the spread to the north, a smaller operation that had struggled for years to compete with the Cartwright ranch's success. Recently, Morrison had been making noise about boundaries that had been settled for decades, claiming that the original surveys were inaccurate and that several hundred acres of prime grazing land rightfully belonged to him. Should I round up the boys? Tommy asked. Ride over there and have a conversation with him? No. Bull stood, his decision made. Violence will only escalate this. Morrison's looking for an excuse to involve the territorial marshal, claim we're the aggressors. Then what do you want to do? Bull looked across the damaged fence line toward Morrison's property, where smoke was already rising from the distant ranch house. I want to handle this legally, properly, which means I need to review every document my father ever signed regarding these boundaries. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Rosanna appeared, riding side saddle on. The gentle mare Bull had selected for her use, her improved strength allowing her to cover the distance from the house without exhausting herself. I saw the smoke from the kitchen window, she said, dismounting with more grace than she'd shown even a month earlier. How bad is it? Bull helped her down, noting how naturally she now accepted his assistance without self-consciousness. Bad. Enough. Morrison's escalating his campaign. Rosanna examined the burned post with the same careful attention Bull had shown. This looks deliberately set. The fire pattern is too contained to be accidental. Both men stared at her in surprise. How do you know about fire patterns? Tommy asked. My father investigated several barn fires for insurance purposes back when I was helping him with church business. Accidental fires spread irregularly. This one was set with accelerant and designed to burn only what Morrison wanted, destroyed. Bull felt a surge of pride at her analytical mind, followed immediately by concern for her involvement. Rosanna, I don't want you worried about this. Morrison's dispute is with me, not Morrison's dispute is with us, she corrected firmly. This is our land, our ranch, our future he's threatening. The word "our" hit Bull with unexpected force. Somewhere along the way, Rosanna had stopped thinking of herself as a temporary resident and started considering herself a true partner in everything he'd built. She's right, Tommy said, his respect for the boss's wife evident in his tone. This affects all of us, and if she knows something about investigating fires, we'd be fools not to listen. Over the following days, the situation with Morrison continued to deteriorate. More fences were cut, cattle were scattered, and water sources were contaminated with debris. Each incident was carefully calculated to cause maximum inconvenience, while avoiding outright violence that would bring outside law enforcement. Bull found himself torn between his protective instincts regarding Rosanna and his growing recognition that her strategic mind was exactly what he needed to counter Morrison's campaign. She'd insisted on reviewing all the boundary documents with him, her neat handwriting creating organized summaries of decades of legal papers. "Your father was meticulous," she observed one evening as they worked in his study. "Every transaction is documented, every boundary marker recorded, but there's something strange here." "What do you mean?" She spread several documents across the desk. "Look at these dates. Your father purchased the disputed section from someone named Ezra Whitfield in 1847, but according to this territorial survey, Whitfield had already sold the same land to Morrison's father 3 months earlier." Bull leaned over her shoulder to examine the papers, breathing in the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to surround her. "That would mean that one of these sales was illegal. Either your father bought stolen land, or Morrison's father did." The implications were staggering. If Rosanna was right, their entire conflict with Morrison was based on a fundamental question of legal ownership that had never been properly resolved. "We need to find Ezra Whitfield," Bull said. "I don't think that's possible," Rosanna replied softly. "According to the church records, he died in 1849, but there might be other documentation in the territorial capital. Court records, probate documents, something that would clarify which sale was legitimate." Bull straightened, his mind racing with possibilities. "That's a 3-day ride minimum. Then we'd better plan carefully." Bull's protective instincts flared immediately. "Rosanna, I can't ask you to make that journey. The road is rough, and if Morrison realizes what we're doing—" "Bull," her voice was patient but firm, "I'm the one who found this discrepancy. I'm the one who knows which documents we need and how to research territorial records. And I'm your wife, your partner. You're not asking me to come with you. I'm telling you that I'm coming." The determination in her voice reminded him powerfully of the wild stallion he'd been trying to gentle. Thunder had the same quality, a spirit that could be partnered with but never dominated. That night, as they made their preparations for the journey to the territorial capital, Bull found himself watching Rosanna with new eyes. The broken woman he'd married 6 months earlier had transformed into someone he barely recognized. Confident, analytical, and absolutely fearless when it came to defending what was theirs. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked, catching him staring. "About the journey?" "No." "About what?" Bull moved to the window, looking out over the ranch that represented 3 generations of Cartwright blood and sweat. "About everything I thought I knew about strength." Rosanna joined him at the window, her reflection pale in the glass beside his. "What do you mean?" "I married you because I thought you were strong enough to survive this life. But I was wrong about what kind of strength you possessed. I don't understand." Bull turned to face her, his expression serious. "I thought your strength was in endurance, in surviving what life threw at you. But these past few weeks, watching you analyze these documents, seeing you take charge of this situation, I realize your real strength is in fighting. In refusing to let anyone take what belongs to you." "To us," she corrected. "To us," he agreed, and for the first time since their wedding, the word felt completely natural. As they prepared for bed that night, Bull found himself thinking about the burned fence post that had started this crisis. Morrison had meant it as a symbol of destruction, a warning of what he could take away. Instead, it had become something else entirely. The catalyst that had finally shown Bull and Rosanna what they could accomplish together when they stopped thinking of themselves as strangers bound by necessity and started acting like true partners in every sense of the word. The hidden deed lay buried beneath 20 years of accumulated papers in the bottom drawer of Bull's father's desk, its yellowed parchment crackling as Rosanna carefully unfolded it. She'd been organizing the study while Bull was out checking. The damaged fences, trying to create order from decades of business correspondence, when her fingers had brushed against something that didn't belong with the routine ranch documents. At first glance, it appeared to be another boundary agreement, the kind of legal paperwork that filled several boxes in the study. But as her eyes traced the faded ink, her breath caught in her throat. "Land deed and title transfer," she read aloud to the empty room, "from Thomas Finch to Magnus Cartwright for the sum of $50 and other valuable considerations. This portion of land described as..." The description that followed made her hands shake. It was the exact acreage that Morrison was now claiming, the disputed territory that had sparked their current conflict. But the name at the top of the document made her sink heavily into Bull's desk chair. Thomas Finch, her father. According to the deed, dated 1845, 2 years before Bull's father had supposedly purchased the land from Ezra Whitfield, her own father had owned the disputed territory and sold it to Magnus Cartwright for a fraction of its value. $50, she whispered, her mind reeling. The land was worth thousands now, had been worth hundreds even then. Why would her father have sold it so cheaply? She continued reading, her heart sinking with each line. The deed contained a clause that made everything clear. This sale made under duress and financial necessity, with the understanding that the Finch family retains the right of first refusal should the Cartwright family ever choose to sell said property. Financial duress. Her father had been desperate for money that would have been needed for her mother's medical care during her final illness. He'd sold the family's most valuable asset to Magnus Cartwright for a pittance, and had been too proud to ever tell his daughter that their family had once owned some of the finest grazing land in the territory. The implications crashed over her like a physical blow. Morrison's claim to the land was fraudulent. He was basing his case on Ezra Whitfield's supposed sale to his father, but Whitfield had never owned the land to begin with. Her father had sold it legally to Magnus Cartwright 2 years before Whitfield even arrived in the territory, but more than that, according to the right of first refusal clause. If the land were ever to change hands again, it should be offered to the Finch family before anyone else. Technically, legally, she might be the rightful heir to the very land that Morrison was trying to steal from her husband. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her churning thoughts. Bull was returning from his inspection of the fence line, and she could hear Tommy Brennan's voice mixing with his as they discussed their findings. Rosanna carefully refolded the deed and placed it in her lap, her mind racing as she tried to process what this discovery meant. Should she tell Bull immediately? Should she confront her father first? Should she keep the knowledge to herself until she understood all the implications? "Rosanna?" Bull's voice carried from the front hallway. "Are you in the study?" "Yes," she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm here." Bull appeared in the doorway, his face grim with the day's frustrations, but his expression softened when he saw her surrounded by organized stacks of papers. "Making progress on that chaos?" he asked, gesturing toward the formerly disorganized desk. "More than you might expect," she said carefully. "Bull, I need to show you something." His attention sharpened at her tone. "What is it?" She held out the deed with hands that trembled slightly. "I found this in the bottom drawer, hidden beneath everything else." Bull took the document and began reading, his expression changing from curiosity to confusion to something approaching shock. "This can't be right," he said finally. "Your father owned this land, apparently, and sold it to your father for $50 in 1845. But the documents we found earlier, Whitfield's sale to my father, was dated 1847, which means your father bought the same land twice, once legitimately from my father, and once from a man who was either a fraud or was selling land he didn't own." Bull sank into the chair across from her, the deed still in his hands. Why would my father have made two purchases for the same property? I don't think he knew about the first one, Rosanna said quietly. Look at where this deed was hidden. Your father wouldn't have buried it beneath all those other papers if he'd been referring to it regularly. I think he forgot he owned that land legally, and when Whitfield approached him with another deed to the same property, he assumed Whitfield was the legitimate owner. But that would mean that Morrison's entire claim is based on a fraudulent sale. Whitfield never owned the land. He couldn't legally sell what wasn't his. Bull stared at the deed for a long moment. And this clause about right of first refusal means that technically, if ownership were ever to be disputed, it should revert to the Finch family before anyone else could claim it. The words hung in the air between them like a loaded gun. Bull looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Rosanna, he said slowly, do you understand what this means? It means we can stop Morrison's claim completely. No. Bull's voice was quiet, but intense. It means you can stop Morrison's claim. This deed makes you the legal owner of that land. Not me, not us, you. The reality of her situation crashed over her like cold water. If she chose to press her legal claim, she wouldn't just be stopping Morrison. She would be taking ownership of some of the most valuable property in the territory. She would go from being a dependent wife to being a landowner in her own right. What are you going to do? Bull asked, and she heard something in his voice that she'd never heard before. Fear. I don't know, she admitted. I hadn't thought that far ahead. The land is worth more than most people make in a lifetime. You could sell it, take the money, start over anywhere you wanted. You wouldn't need... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Wouldn't need you, she completed for him. Yes, Rosanna studied his face in the lamplight, seeing vulnerability there that he'd never shown her before. This strong, confident man, who owned thousands of acres and commanded the respect of everyone in the territory, was afraid that she would leave him. Bull, she said gently, do you think I would do that? I don't know. 6 months ago, I thought I was marrying a broken woman who would be grateful for any security I could provide. But the woman sitting across from me now, you're not broken. You're not dependent. You don't need me the way I thought you would. You're right, she said, and watched his face fall. I'm not the same woman you married. But Bull, what you don't understand is that the woman I've become exists because of what we've built together. This ranch, this partnership, this life we're creating. It's made me stronger than I ever was on my own. She leaned forward in her chair. Yes, this deed changes everything. It means I have choices I never had before, but it also means something else. What? It means that when I choose to stay with you, when I choose to fight Morrison alongside you, when I choose to build a future here, it's not because I have no other options. It's because this is what I want. Bull's expression began to change, hope replacing fear in his dark eyes. You could claim that land, he said. I could. You could be wealthy in your own right. I could. But you won't. Rosanna smiled, feeling a certainty she hadn't experienced in years. Oh, I'm going to claim the land. I'm going to use this deed to destroy Morrison's case completely. But Bull, I'm not claiming it for myself. Then for who? For us. For the ranch. For the future we're building together. She stood and moved around the desk to stand beside his chair. I'm claiming it so that no one can ever again question our right to everything we've built. So that our children, if we're blessed with them, will inherit not just your legacy, but mine as well. Bull stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest with a desperation that spoke of how afraid he'd been of losing her. Are you certain? He asked against her hair. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. She pulled back to look at him. This deed doesn't just settle our dispute with Morrison. It settles every doubt I've ever had about whether I truly belong here. And how's that? Because now I know that my being here isn't just about your choice or your charity. It's about coming home to land that was always meant to be mine, and choosing to share it with the man I love. The words were out before she could stop them, but she realized she didn't want to take them back. Bull's eyes widened with surprise and something deeper. "Love?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said simply. "Love. Real, chosen, partnership love." When he kissed her this time, it wasn't the careful kiss of their wedding day or the gentle kisses of growing affection they'd shared recently. It was the kiss of two people who had found in each other exactly what they'd been looking for, even when they hadn't known they were looking for it. Bull's grandfather's rifle rested in its place of honor above the fireplace, its Civil War-era barrel polished to a dull gleam that spoke of careful maintenance across 3 generations. The weapon had defended this land when it was still contested. Territory had protected the first Cartwright homestead from raiders and claim jumpers, and had been passed down with the solemn understanding that some things were worth fighting for. Now, as Bull lifted it from its brackets in the pre-dawn darkness, he hoped it wouldn't be needed today, but Lucas Morrison had made it clear that legal documents and property rights meant nothing to him. Only force would settle this dispute. "You don't have to do this," Rosanna said quietly from the doorway. She was fully dressed, despite the early hour, her dark hair braided back and her expression set with determination. "We could take the deed to the territorial marshal, let the law handle Morrison. The nearest marshal is 3 days' ride away," Bull replied, checking the rifle's action with practiced movements. "Morrison made his position clear yesterday. He's not waiting for legal proceedings. The previous day had brought Morrison's ultimatum, delivered by a hired gun with cold eyes and a reputation for violence. Either Bull would deed over the disputed territory by noon today, or Morrison would take it by force, along with whatever additional land he felt was owed him for his trouble. Tommy's rounded up 12 good men." Bull continued, settling the rifle's weight against his shoulder to test its balance. "All hands who've been with the ranch for years. They know what's at stake." 13, Rosanna corrected. Bull turned to look at her, noting the riding clothes and the small revolver tucked into her belt, his own gun, which he'd taught her to use over the past months. "Absolutely not. Bull, we've had this discussion. That deed makes me as much a target as you are. Morrison knows by now that his claim is worthless, which means his only option is to eliminate the evidence and the witnesses, which is exactly why you need to stay here, where it's safe." Rosanna moved into the room, her walking stick tapping softly against the wooden floor. Her mobility had improved dramatically over the past months, but she still relied on the carved wooden cane for longer distances or when fatigue set in. "Where it's safe?" she asked with a slight smile. "Bull, if Morrison decides to burn us out, this house will be his first target. At least out there with you and the men, I'll have some chance to defend myself." The logic was sound, but every protective instinct Bull possessed rebelled against the idea of bringing his wife into a gunfight. "Rosanna, you've never been in a real fight. You don't understand what it's like when the shooting starts." "You're right," she agreed calmly, "but I understand what it's like to lose everything that matters, and I won't sit in this house waiting to find out if my husband is coming home." Bull set the rifle aside and moved to face her directly. "If something happens to you, then at least it will happen while I'm fighting for something I believe in, alongside the man I love." She reached up to touch his face. "Bull, 6 months ago I was a broken woman with no future and no hope. You gave me both of those things. You think I'm going to hide in the house now while someone tries to take them away?" Before Bull could respond, Tommy Brennan appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Morrison's on the move," he reported. "Our lookout spotted riders heading this way. At least 15 men, all armed. They'll be here within the hour." Bull felt his jaw tighten. 15 men was more than he'd expected. Morrison wasn't just trying to steal land. He was planning to wipe out the Cartwright ranch entirely. "Are our boys ready?" "Ready as they'll ever be," Tommy confirmed. "We've got good positions picked, out plenty of ammunition, and every man here knows what he's fighting for." "And Mrs. Cartwright?" Tommy's eyes flicked to Rosanna. "What are your orders regarding—" "Mrs. Cartwright will be fighting alongside us," Rosanna said before Bull could speak. The deed that proves our ownership of the disputed land is in my name. That makes this my fight as much as anyone's." Tommy's weathered face showed surprise, but also respect. "Yes, ma'am. In that case, I'd suggest you take position in the barn loft. Good field of fire, solid cover, and you can watch our backs while we engage Morrison's main force." Bull wanted to object, but he could see the determination in both their faces. More importantly, he could see that Tommy was right. If they were going to face 15 gunmen with only 13 defenders, they needed every advantage they could get. "All right," he said finally, "but you stay in the loft, unless things go very badly, promise me." "I promise to use good judgment," Rosanna replied, which wasn't quite the same thing. As they made their final preparations, Bull found himself thinking about the path that had brought them to this moment. 7 months ago, he'd married a woman he barely knew in pursuit of an heir to carry on his family's legacy. Now, he was preparing to fight beside that same woman to defend something they'd built together. Not just land and cattle, but a partnership that had transformed them both. "Bull!" Rosanna's voice broke into his thoughts. "Yes, there's something I need to tell you. In case things don't go as we hope." The seriousness in her tone made him give her his complete attention. "What is it?" "I'm pregnant." The words hit him like a physical blow. "What?" "Dr. Henley confirmed it yesterday, but I wanted to be certain before I told you." Her hand moved unconsciously to her still flat stomach. "About 2 months along, he thinks." Bull stared at her, his mind reeling. 2 months, that means... It happened right around the time we found the deed, the night we first told each other. She paused, color rising in her cheeks. "The night we first made love as husband and wife, instead of 2 strangers sharing a bed." Bull reached for the nearest chair, his legs suddenly unsteady. "A baby, we're having a baby." "Yes, the heir you wanted, the child your father demanded, the continuation of the Cartwright legacy." She moved closer to him. "But Bull, that's not why I'm telling you now." "Then why?" "Because I want you to know that if something happens today, if Morrison wins, your legacy won't die with us. This child will carry both our names, Cartwright and Finch. All the strength and stubbornness and determination that built this ranch will live on, no matter what." Bull stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he could protect her from the coming fight through sheer force of will. "Nothing's going to happen to you," he said fiercely. "Nothing's going to happen to either of you. Bull, I mean it. Morrison can have every acre of land in the territory before I'll let anything happen to my family." "Your family?" she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." "Good, because that's what we are now. Not just husband and wife, not just partners in a business arrangement, but a family. And families protect each other." Tommy's voice called from outside. "Boss!" Morrison's riders are visible on the North Ridge. 5 minutes out, maybe less. Bull released Rosanna reluctantly, his hands lingering on her face. "Are you ready for this?" "I've been ready since the day you married me," she replied. "I just didn't know it then." As they left the house together, Bull carrying his grandfather's rifle and Rosanna moving with steady purpose despite her walking stick, the ranch hands were taking their positions. These were good men, cowboys who'd worked this land for years and understood that they weren't just fighting for their jobs, they were fighting for their home. "Mrs. Cartwright," called Jake Morrison, one of the younger hands, "there's a ladder to the loft already in position. You'll have clear sight lines from up there." "Thank you, Jake." Rosanna's voice was steady, showing none of the fear Bull knew. She must be feeling. As she climbed carefully into the barn loft, Bull took his position behind the stone watering trough that would serve as his cover. Around the ranch yard, his men were hidden behind buildings, fence posts, and whatever other cover they could find. In the distance, Morrison's riders appeared over the ridge, a dark line of men silhouetted against the morning sky. They rode with the confidence of superior numbers, certain that this would be an easy victory. "Remember," Bull called to his men, "we let them get in close, don't waste ammunition on long shots, and nobody fires until I give the word." "Understood, boss." came Tommy's reply from his position behind the blacksmith shop. Bull checked his rifle one more time, thinking about the generations of Cartwrights who had defended this land before him. His grandfather had fought claim jumpers with this same weapon. His father had used it to protect their cattle from raiders and their family from those who would take what they'd built. Now it was Bull's turn to stand guard over everything the Cartwright name represented, not just land and cattle and money, but the idea that a man and woman could build something lasting together, something worth fighting for, something worth passing on to their children. As Morrison's riders drew closer, Bull felt a calmness settle over him. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of his ranch, but the future of his family. Above him in the barn loft, he could sense Rosanna taking position at the window, ready to defend their home, with the same fierce determination that had carried her through 3 years of recovery and 7 months of transformation. They were ready for whatever Lucas Morrison had in mind, and Morrison was about to learn that some things were worth any price to protect. The town bell began its urgent clanging just as Morrison's riders crested the final hill before the ranch house, its iron voice carrying across the valley with a message that every resident of Dustvale understood. Trouble at the Cartwright spread. All able-bodied men needed immediately. Bull heard the bell's call and felt a surge of hope he hadn't expected. Someone in town had spotted Morrison's armed party and raised the alarm. Help might be coming, but it would take time to arrive, and Morrison clearly intended to finish this before any reinforcements could reach them. Cartwright. Morrison's voice boomed across the ranch yard as his 15 riders spread out in a threatening semicircle. You've got 2 minutes to come out here and sign over that deed, or my boys will burn everything you've built to the ground. Bull remained hidden behind the stone watering trough, his grandfather's rifle steady in his hands. From his position he could see Morrison clearly, a lean, weathered man in his 50s whose years of struggle and resentment had hardened him into something cruel and desperate. "I'm right here, Morrison," Bull called back, not bothering to show himself. "But I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding about that deed." "No misunderstanding. That land should have been mine years ago, and I'm taking it today." "See, that's where you're wrong." To Bull's amazement, Rosanna's voice carried clearly from the barn loft, steady and confident despite the deadly situation. "The land you're claiming was never yours to begin with." Morrison's head snapped toward the barn, his expression darkening. Well, the cripple wants to play lawyer. Boys, looks like we'll have to teach both of them some manners." The insult sent a wave of fury through Bull, but he forced himself to remain calm. Anger would make him careless, and carelessness would get them all killed. "Actually," Rosanna continued, apparently unbothered by Morrison's crude words, "I have documentation here that proves your entire claim is fraudulent. The man who sold that land to your father never owned it in the first place." Bull saw several of Morrison's men exchange uncertain glances. They'd been told this was a simple matter of taking disputed land from a rival rancher, not stealing property with clear legal ownership. "You're lying," Morrison snarled, but Bull heard uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Thomas Finch, my father, sold that land legally to Magnus Cartwright in 1845, 2 years before your father bought it from Ezra Whitfield, who was either a fraud or selling land he had no right to sell." Morrison's face went white, then flushed, red with rage. "I don't care what some moldy old papers say. I've worked that land for 20 years, and I'm not giving it up to some half-dead woman and her fool husband." "Then you're stealing," Rosanna said simply, "and these witnesses will testify to that fact when the territorial marshal arrives." "The marshal's not coming, lady, and after today there won't be any witnesses left to testify about anything." Morrison raised his hand to signal his men, but before he could give the order to attack, the sound of approaching hoofbeats came from the east. A lone rider was approaching fast, bent low over his horse's neck in the universal posture of urgent news. Dr. Henley pulled his horse to a sliding stop just outside the ring of Morrison's men, his medical bag bouncing wildly behind his saddle. "Morrison!" he called breathlessly. "You need to stop this right now." "Stay out of this, Doc. This is between me and Cartwright." "No, it's not." Henley straightened in his saddle, his normally gentle demeanor replaced by the authority of a man, accustomed to being obeyed in emergencies. "The whole town knows what you're planning, and they won't stand for it. Reverend Finch has ridden to the territorial capital to fetch the marshal, and half the men in Dustvale are saddling up to come out here." Bull felt a surge of gratitude toward Rosanna's father. The old preacher had obviously understood the threat and taken action to protect his daughter and son-in-law. "I don't care about the town," Morrison spat. "By the time anyone gets here, this will be finished." "Will it?" Dr. Henley's voice carried clearly across the ranch yard. "Because I need to tell you something about the woman you're threatening. Mrs. Cartwright isn't just fighting for land today, she's fighting for her unborn child." Bull heard Rosanna's sharp intake of breath from the loft. They hadn't intended to make her pregnancy public knowledge, but Dr. Henley was clearly trying to use every tool at his disposal to prevent bloodshed. "That's right," the doctor continued, his voice growing stronger. "You're threatening to kill a pregnant woman for land that legally belongs to her family. How do you think that's going to sit with a territorial judge? How do you think it's going to sit with the good people of Dustvale?" Several of Morrison's hired guns shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Fighting over disputed land was one thing, but threatening an expectant mother was another matter entirely. "Shut up, old man," Morrison snarled. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns every decent person in this territory," Dr. Henley replied firmly, "and if you go through with this, you'll have to answer to all of them." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, his face twisted with rage and desperation. Bull could see that the man had gone too far to back down now. His reputation, his pride, and his own desperate financial situation had trapped him into a course of action that could only end in violence. "Enough talk," Morrison growled. "Boys, burn them out, all of them." As Morrison's men reached for their weapons, Bull took careful aim with his grandfather's rifle. The time for words had passed. Now, it was time to discover what the Cartwright family was truly made of. Rosanna's walking stick fell from the barn loft window with a sharp crack as it hit the ground below, and in that moment, everything changed. She stood tall and straight in the loft opening, her revolver steady in her hands, no longer the broken woman who had needed support to walk, but a fierce protector defending her home and family. "Morrison!" she called out, her voice carrying a strength that silenced even the hired gunman. "You have one chance to ride away from here. Take it." The sight of her standing without her cane, straight-backed and defiant, seemed to shock Morrison as much as his own men. For 7 months, everyone in the territory had seen her as the crippled woman Bull Cartwright had married out of pity. Now they were seeing the truth. A woman who had overcome her limitations through sheer force of will. "You think throwing away a stick makes you dangerous?" Morrison sneered, but Bull could hear the uncertainty beneath his bravado. "No," Rosanna replied calmly, "but the legal deed in my possession makes you a thief, and the baby I'm carrying makes you a man who threatens pregnant women. Those things make you dangerous to yourself." Morrison's face contorted with rage. "Enough of this. I came here for land, and I'm not leaving without it." He turned to his men. "Take them." The first shot came from Morrison himself, aimed at Bull's position behind the stone trough. The bullet sparked off the rocks, sending chips of stone flying. Bull returned fire immediately, his grandfather's rifle speaking with authority as the bullet took Morrison's hat clean off his head. Chaos erupted. Across the ranch yard, Morrison's hired guns opened fire while Bull's ranch hands returned it with disciplined volleys. Tommy Brennan's rifle cracked from behind the blacksmith shop, dropping one of Morrison's men from his saddle. Jake Peterson and 2 other hands provided covering fire from the barn, while their comrades maneuvered for better positions. From her position in the loft, Rosanna had a clear view of the entire fight. Her first shot took the gun out of the hands of a hired gun who was drawing a bead on Tommy. Her second convinced another gunman to seek better cover behind his horse rather than try to outshoot a woman who clearly knew how to use a weapon. "She's got the high ground," one of Morrison's men shouted. "Take out that loft." 3 rifles swung toward the barn, but Bull had anticipated this. His next shot took down the leader before he could fire, while Tommy's rifle accounted for another. The third man's nerve broke entirely, and he spurred his horse away from the fight. Morrison's superior numbers were proving less decisive than he'd expected. Bull's men knew every inch of the ranch yard, had chosen their positions carefully, and were fighting for their home rather than for hired wages. Meanwhile, Morrison's gunmen were discovering that threatening pregnant women and stealing land didn't inspire the kind of loyalty that won gunfights. "This is madness, Morrison," Dr. Henley shouted from his position near the gate. "3 of your men are down, and more are running. End this before someone gets killed." "It ends when I get—" "What I came for!" Morrison snarled back, but Bull could see the desperation in the man's movements. His grand plan for seizing the disputed land was falling apart, and he was too proud to accept defeat. Morrison made his fatal mistake when he decided to end the fight with a desperate charge toward the house. Standing up in his stirrups, he spurred his horse directly at Bull's position, firing wildly with both pistols. Bull's grandfather's rifle thundered one final time. Morrison jerked in his saddle, then toppled backward, landing hard in the dusty ranch yard. His riderless horse continued its charge, then veered away toward the open range. The sudden silence that followed Morrison's fall was deafening. His remaining men looked from their fallen leader to the determined faces of the ranch defenders, calculating odds that were no longer in their favor. "Anyone else want to try stealing from pregnant women?" Tommy Brennan's voice carried clearly across the yard, his rifle still aimed at the remaining gunmen. One by one, Morrison's hired guns holstered their weapons and raised their hands. The fight was over. Bull emerged from behind the stone trough, his grandfather's rifle still ready but no longer needed. Around the ranch yard, his men were doing the same, their faces grim but relieved. "Rosanna," he called to the loft. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she called back. "Better than fine," as she climbed down from the loft. Bull noticed that she moved with more confidence than he'd ever seen from her. The physical act of casting aside her walking stick seemed to have been symbolic as well as practical. She'd thrown away the last vestige of seeing herself as broken. Dr. Henley was kneeling beside Morrison, checking for a pulse he clearly wouldn't. "Find. He's gone," the doctor announced. "Bull, your shot took him clean through the heart." Bull felt no satisfaction in Morrison's death, only relief that the threat to his family was ended. As Rosanna reached the ground and moved toward him, he saw in her face the same mixture of sorrow and relief. "Is it over?" she asked, accepting his embrace gratefully. "It's over," he confirmed. "We're safe." In the distance, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of the men from Dustvale, led by Reverend Finch himself. But their help was no longer needed. The battle for the Cartwright ranch had been won by the people who belonged there, fighting for what they'd built together. The new ranch sign stood proudly at the entrance to the property, its hand-carved letters gleaming with fresh varnish in the afternoon sun. "Cartwright and Rosanna Ranch," read the inscription, with smaller text below acknowledging the establishment. Date and the 3 generations of family who had built something lasting from the unforgiving frontier soil. Bull had commissioned the sign from the territorial capital's finest woodworker, insisting that every detail be perfect. It wasn't vanity that motivated him, but recognition. This ranch belonged to both of them now, legally and spiritually, and he wanted everyone who passed to understand that fact. 6 months had passed since the confrontation with Morrison, and the changes to both the ranch and its owners were remarkable. Rosanna moved through her daily routine with confidence and grace. Her walking stick retired to a place of honor on the mantel beside Bull's grandfather's rifle. She still favored her left leg slightly, but her limp was barely noticeable, and her strength had returned to the point where she could ride for hours without fatigue. More importantly, her pregnancy was progressing beautifully. At 7 months along, she carried their child with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything else, though Bull couldn't help but notice the way she unconsciously rested her hand on her rounded belly whenever she was deep in thought. "The spring calving reports look excellent," she said from her seat at the kitchen table, reviewing the ledgers that had become as much her domain as his. "Tommy thinks we'll have the best yield in 5 years. Tommy's been saying that every spring." "For 5 years," Bull replied with a smile, settling into the chair across from her. But this time I think he might be right. The ranch had indeed prospered in the months following Morrison's death. Word of the Cartwrights' legal victory and their successful defense of their property had spread throughout the territory, bringing respect and new business opportunities. More importantly, it had brought peace. No other ranchers were likely to challenge property rights that had been settled so definitively. "There's a letter from the territorial governor," Rosanna said, holding up an official-looking envelope. "Something about appointing you to the Territorial Land Commission." Bull took the letter and scanned its contents quickly. "They want me to help settle boundary disputes throughout the territory. Apparently our situation with Morrison has made us something of experts on property law." "Us," Rosanna corrected, gently. "The appointment is for both Mr. and Mrs. Cartwright. You'll notice they specifically mention my research skills and legal analysis." Bull read the letter more carefully and realized she was right. The territorial government wasn't just recognizing his reputation as a successful rancher, they were acknowledging Rosanna as an equal partner in their achievements. "Would you be interested?" he asked. "I think it would be valuable work, helping other families avoid the kind of conflict we faced with Morrison." She paused, her hand moving to her belly again. "Though perhaps we should wait until after the baby arrives." The mention of their coming child never failed to fill Bull with a mixture of joy and protective anxiety. After years of wanting an heir, he'd discovered that the reality of becoming a father was far more complex than he'd expected. This wasn't just about continuing the Cartwright name. It was about bringing a new person into the world who would be shaped by everything he and Rosanna had built together. "Dr. Henley stopped by yesterday while you were checking the north pasture," Rosanna said. "He's very pleased with how everything is progressing." "And you? How are you feeling?" "Strong," she said simply. "Stronger than I've ever felt in my life." It was true, Bull realized. The woman he'd married 10 months ago had been broken in body and spirit, surviving rather than living. The woman sitting across from him now was confident, capable, and utterly unafraid of whatever challenges the future might bring. "I have something for you," Bull said, reaching into his vest pocket. Rosanna looked up curiously as he placed a small wooden box on the table between them. "What's this?" "Open it." Inside the box, nestled in velvet, was a delicate silver locket engraved with the intertwined initials R and J and the date of their wedding. "It's beautiful," she breathed, lifting it carefully from the box. "But what's the occasion?" "No occasion, just I wanted you to have something that marked this time in our lives. Before the baby comes and everything changes again." Rosanna opened the locket to find 2 small spaces for photographs, for pictures of our family, for whatever you want to put in there. "But yes, I was thinking family." She leaned across the table to kiss him, a gesture that had become natural and frequent over the past months. "Help me put it on." As Bull fastened the delicate chain around her neck, he found himself thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a lonely man obsessed with duty and legacy, willing to marry a stranger to fulfill a promise to his dead father. Now he was a husband in the truest sense, preparing to become a father with a woman who had become his closest friend and strongest ally. "Bull?" Rosanna's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Yes? Do you think your father would approve of what we've built here?" The question surprised him. "Why do you ask?" "Because sometimes I wonder if this is what he really meant when he made you. Promise to continue the Cartwright legacy, not just having children, but creating something worth passing on to them. Bull looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their home, warm, welcoming, filled with the evidence of their shared life. Through the window, he could see the ranch that represented 3 generations of hard work and determination. And sitting across from him was the woman who had helped him understand that a legacy wasn't just about blood and property, but about the values and love that shaped a family. "I think," he said carefully, "that my father would be amazed by what we've accomplished, both of us." "Both of us," she agreed, her hand finding his across the table. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Bull and Rosanna sat in comfortable silence, planning for their child's future and reflecting on how far they'd traveled from that awkward wedding ceremony less than a year ago. Outside, the new ranch sign caught the last light of day, its message clear to anyone who passed. This was a place built by 2 people who had found in each other exactly what they needed, even when they hadn't known they were looking for it. "Sometimes love found you when you were broken," Bull reflected, "and sometimes it made you stronger than you'd ever imagined possible." In their case, it had done both.